So, as you've probably guessed by the title, I'm going to be covering my Nintendo-based part of the game collection. I remember a while back I did an entire video on my handhelds and pretty much covered all of them, all the games, the systems, and everything like that, including the modded ones. I'm not going to cover all of my Nintendo stuff in this video because I don't want it to be as long, if not longer. So what I'm going to do today is just focus on NES and Super NES. And I'll do like a part 2, maybe a part 3 where I cover GameCube, Wii, Wii U, and Switch. So this series will not include the handhelds, obviously, because I already did that. I will link that below in case you wanted to take a look at that video. Start first with the NES. This is your standard VCR style NES. It's the front loader. And, you know, they call it the VCR style because Nintendo specifically designed it to look more like a VCR because it was coming out on the catastrophic failure of the video game market back in 1983. Officially, the system was not released until 1986, but it did have a limited release in New York and I believe LA and a couple other markets in 85, where it pretty much dominated and drove everyone crazy and everyone wanted to have a Nintendo. Retailers were, of course, very hesitant to get back into the video game market, but when they saw the excitement for the NES, they said, you know what, we'll take a chance. And lo and behold, if it wasn't for Nintendo, I don't know if video games would be the same at least in the West, North America. The game markets were doing a little bit better in Japan, in many parts of Europe. So this is one that I picked up to repair one that I picked up at a garage sale, had a bad PPU. This one turns out it worked fine, other than the cartridge connector that always seems to fail. I went ahead and just got it working. It plays games once in a while. It'll blink red, but whatever, it works. So Dogbone NES controller I picked up at a local game store. They didn't have any standard ones, you know, the rectangular style, but these are more comfortable anyway. Although I don't like the position of the A and B button. I wish they were more like on a Game Boy where the angle was shifted this way, but it is what it is. I'm trying to find a top loader. They're kind of pricey online and even looking through local sales and things like that. So I'll hold off on that for now. So let's move on to the games. So the first one I'll go over is the obvious multi 852-in-1 that you probably see all over eBay, AliExpress, and even on Amazon. We all know what these are. I'm not going to cover it too much. Mainly picked it up to just take a look at it out of curiosity and also to use it for testing NES consoles, you know, that I was trying to fix this one because I didn't want to potentially damage or ruin an actual game. So I've also got a couple of Famicom games because I do have a Famicom that I repaired a while back, and I'll link that video below too if I remember. But I picked up a Super Real Baseball 88 to test the system out because I had no way of testing it if I got it working or not. But whatever, it's your typical baseball game. I did pick up Mario 3 for it because why not? You got to have Mario 3 in your collection, even though I've already got it on the NES, which we'll cover later. Move those out of the way for now, and we'll just go alphabetically. Next game I have on my collection is Bad Dudes. It's just your typical side-scrolling beat-em-up. Not a very great one. The frame rate in this is not good at all. The arcade version of this game is much, much better if you get a chance to play that. But this one is still kind of fun, you know. I remember having it as a kid, so picked it up for my collection. Next one is Blades of Steel, another game that I had growing up. It's a hockey game, but it was unique in that it wasn't cartoonish like some of the other hockey games that were out. This one actually had a little bit more, quote-unquote, realistic-looking players, a little bit more of a side view of the rink instead of a top view. This one was also unique in that it had digitized speech and had actual hockey fights in there. So you can even see, kind of alludes to it right there. So that's kind of neat, you know. It was a fun hockey game. You know, you could sit there and set the different rules. You had a certain set of teams you could pick, and it's not licensed by the NHL or the NHLPA, so you don't have actual teams or players. You just have city names and stuff like that. So next game we'll cover is Crystalis. This is a really good game. It's a action-adventure RPG type game. It's similar to Zelda in terms of gameplay, but it also adds some RPG elements to it, such as magic, leveling up, etc. Probably more accurately, it's kind of like a mix between Zelda 1 and 2, with Zelda 1's style of gameplay and Zelda 2's leveling up and everything. The storyline is basically you're the hero who was put into cryogenic stasis. You awaken in 1997 to a world that's in ruin. The only piece of technology that seems to exist is the cryogenic machine that you woke up from, and that's basically it. Then it gets destroyed after you wake up, and you're in your first town. And you just go around the world, leveling up, beating enemies, until you get to the last boss. It's a really good game, good music. Gameplay is pretty solid. There was a port of it to the Game Boy Color. Not a fan of that one, only because it changed the music. I'm not sure why they did that, but they did. So that's, I don't necessarily recommend that one, although you might like that version better. I don't know. But I had that, so I picked it up as well. Next is Dr. Mario. Everyone should know by now what game this is and what it's like. It's a puzzle game. The goal is to eliminate all the viruses on screen using these pills. You've got red, blue, and yellow viruses, and you just got to match up the same color pill or the same half of the pill. So this was released on the Game Boy. On the Super Nintendo as part of Tetris and Dr. Mario. I think there was a Dr. Mario 64, if I remember correctly. There was also a Weber title. There was a Dr. Luigi for the Year of Luigi. Many different versions of it. Fun game. My favorite version of the game is actually on the Game Boy. But if you don't have one of those, if you have an NES, make sure you pick this game up. Next game is Dragon Warrior. It is a JRPG, and pretty sure it was the first JRPG in the West. At least exposed us to that style of RPG. Before then, the only role-playing games we had here in the West were more like your King's Quest and stuff like that. But it just, with the storyline and everything, at first, the JRPGs didn't really catch on too much in the West, but they eventually did, and I'm glad that they did, and I'm glad that I was able to play this game as a kid and that I own it now as an adult. There were many, many, many sequels. I wish I had Dragon Warrior 2, because that was my favorite out of all of them, but I'm still looking for that copy. Next I have is Excite Bike. Also have the manual for it. If you're not sure what this is, it's basically a motocross type game. It moves from left to right, so you don't have like a rotating track or anything like that. But you have different ramps, jumps, oil slicks, things like that are designed to slow you down or allow you to gain ahead, etc. But the unique part of this is that you could design your own courses and your own tracks, 2-player, 1-player, what have you. And that was probably one of the main reasons why I bought this game as a kid and now as an adult, because it was just fun. So next we'll talk about Iron Sword. It's actually a sequel to Wizards and Warriors, which I'll get to later. It's your typical action adventure game, platformer. You run around and beat enemies and go to different levels, level yourself up, weapons, armor upgrade, save the day, etc. The reason I had this game as a kid is because my mom bought it for me for Christmas. She also bought my cousin a copy as well. And the only reason she bought it is because of the fact that Fabio was on the cover. So they used him as the actor for the Western release of the game, or at least here in North America. I'm not sure if Europe got the same label or not, but it's not a bad game. It's a lot of fun. And if you like, platforming and adventuring, I'd take a look at it. Next is probably my favorite NES game and maybe even favorite Mega Man game, and that's Mega Man 3. I know some people don't like it as much as 2. I get why, but I just personally like this one. I like the music in it. I like the levels, the introduction of Rush and being able to slide and things like that. Not a very expensive game to collect right now. Mega Man 2 is actually worth a lot more, as is Mega Man 4, which is another good game too. But if you have a chance to pick up 3, I would do so. It's a lot of fun. Next, we'll talk about Rad Racer. It was made by Square, published by Nintendo here in the West. Yes, it's that Square, the RPG king, quote unquote. It's your typical racing game, similar to Outrun, things like that. This did have support for 3D if you had the 3D goggles. I don't think those were ever released in North America, but the Famicom did have a set. It's a decent game. It's a nice little time killer if you have 10, 20 minutes to waste. Not a bad game to do. There is a part 2 as well. Getting down to the end of the left pile here. This is Shadowgate. This was originally released on PCs and Macintosh, I believe. So they ported it to the NES. But the big improvement that came with it is that there was a soundtrack now. I did not play the PC version. If there even was one, I might be mistaken on that. I know there was one for the Mac. It did not have any sounds or anything like that. This one does. It's a fun game. It's basically one of those point-and-click adventures, but you've got to use your controller instead of a mouse in this case, so it's a little bit more cumbersome to play, but it is worth it. It's got some good visuals in there for an NES game, good music, and lots of trial and error as well. So, all right, let's move on to the right pile. This here is Star Tropics. It's an RPG that was published by Nintendo, and didn't have it as a kid, but I was always interested in it. It was only released in North America and Europe. It was never released in Japan for some reason. That's kind of interesting, but, you know, hey, cool. We got our own exclusives now. So I haven't played much of it since I got it. I started it off, and then, of course, you get distracted by other things and everything. It did pretty well enough that there was a sequel, Zoda's Revenge. Maybe one day I'll actually sit down and play this through completely instead of just picking up here and there. We'll see. Next is probably familiar to every single person out there, especially if you had an NES growing up, because this is probably the game that it came with, Super Mario Brothers Duck Hunt. Duck Hunt made use of the NES Zapper. You basically shoot dogs. You wanted to shoot the dog if you played this before. You shoot ducks, and you know, one comes up on screen. Sometimes you'll have two. You have a certain level of ammo. You have to get a certain number of kills as you progress through the game, or you get a game over. There was also a third option, a clay pigeon thing where they shoot clay pigeons out and you shoot them, and it was a good little time waster. But the big game, of course, was Super Mario Brothers. Everyone knows what that's about. Your typical action platformer, run from level to level, getting power-ups, beating enemies. At the end of the day, saving the princess. So next is Super Mario Brothers 2. No surprise. This is the Western version of Super Mario Brothers 2 because we didn't get the actual Super Mario Brothers 2 that Japan got, which was a direct sequel to Mario 1. And that's because A, Nintendo of America thought it would be too similar, and B, they thought it was too difficult. So they instead went into Doki Doki Panic, resprited it, tuned some things, and we got Super Mario Brothers 2. And it's actually a good thing because this is actually a pretty good game. It's a nice change of pace from the original formula. However, they decided to go back to the original formula with Super Mario Brothers 3. This is probably my favorite game of all time. At the very least, it's my favorite Nintendo game and definitely my favorite Mario game. On top of the typical power-ups of the Super Mushroom, the Fire Flower, and Starman, you also have a bunch of different other suits. Raccoon Mario, Tanuki Mario, Hammer Bros, Frog Suit, etc. Basically picks up where Mario 1 left off. Bowser's back, kidnaps the princess, but this time he's got his Koopalings with him. And instead of having just 4 levels per stage, you have a wide variety of levels per stage, or per world. So a lot of fun. If you haven't played it, why? Just play it already. It's a good game, fun game, and you'll definitely enjoy it. Next game really doesn't need any introduction. I've got it with the manual as well. It's Tetris. Everyone knows what this is by now. If you don't, I don't know what to tell you. This is the Nintendo published version of Tetris. There's another version of Tetris that was published by not Atari. We'll call them Tengen. Yeah, so there's a different version. The Tengen games were basically, I don't want to call them bootlegs because they weren't. They were published by an actual company, but without the blessing of Nintendo. There's a whole lawsuit about it. Probably look it up online and get more information than I'll be able to give you in this little video here. So the Game Boy version, again, is my favorite version out of all of them, though there was along with Dr. Mario, a port to the Super Nintendo. They just called it Tetris and Dr. Mario. 16-bit graphics, sound, but it's the same games otherwise. Next is a controversial game, and I say controversial because a lot of people have a lot of memories about it, and that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This is a action platformer, and it was noted for its difficulty, especially the underwater level, which was just the worst. Probably everyone's least favorite part of the game, but the rest of the game was fun. You side scroll, hack and slash, pick any one of the 4 turtles. One thing a lot of people did notice, of course. So if you look at the turtles, they all have the same colored bandanas, I guess. Whatever these are called. And they're supposed to have different colors. Red was Raphael, blue was Leonardo, purple Donatello, and orange Michelangelo. They do have the appropriate weapons, but they didn't give them the right colors. So
Here we have Wizards and Warriors. This is the first I believe there was a trilogy. It was technically a Game Boy game, but we won't talk about that one. This is Wizards and Warriors. Same description as Iron Sword. You just run around. It's an action-adventure platformer, save the day type thing. I didn't own it as a child. I did rent it once and played it. It was all right. I liked Iron Sword better, but I picked it up, to add to my collection now. And then we'll just go over these last two NES games at once because they're kind of the same. And that's WrestleMania and WrestleMania Challenge. I think there might be another game. There might have been a Steel Cage Challenge. I know there was one on the Master System. I don't know if it came out for the NES or not. But if you were a wrestling fan, especially in the 80s, this is pretty much what you had. So different wrestlers you could pick. The theme songs played on the character selection screen. You had a basic rink. WrestleMania did not have any of the special moves, though, just your basic kicks and punch and body slams and stuff like that. Not sure on WrestleMania Challenge. I actually haven't played it. It was just one of my goals to collect all of the retro WWF games for NES, Super NES, Genesis, etc. So I haven't had a whole lot of opportunity to actually play it yet. I know that they started introducing the special moves in the Super Nintendo versions of like Super WrestleMania, etc. So that's it for NES. I do have a Famicom as well that I'm not going to show because it's in another spot and I don't feel like disconnecting everything, but I'll link the video below to where I did a cleaning, restoration, and an AV mod to it to get it to work on our televisions here. I have a Famicom disk system that I want to try and fix up. I'm waiting for some stuff to come in, although by the time this video comes out, I might already have those parts. Not sure when I'll release that video. We'll see. But that's it for, like I said, NES. I got the NES Classic as well. I've also got a Retro in HD, which sucks, but I picked one up. It was dirt cheap, and I use it for testing cartridges that I pick up before I actually use them in my real NES, because if these are not working correctly, I don't want them to damage this anymore. So we will move on now to Super Nintendo. So you see here a Smoke Shell Black Super Nintendo that I worked on a while back and used. So long story short, I bought a lot of 3 broken Super Nintendos. Turns out all 3 of them technically worked. They just needed some parts swapped. I've got this one here. I've got another one that I completely refurbished, put in a original shell that has very minor cracks, but it definitely wasn't as bad as when it came in. And I've got a third board that needs a cartridge slot for it. But I decided to do this. I liked the Smoke Shell. Now, of course, after I put this together, an announcement was made that they came out with a kind of like a smoke purple shell, which I would have liked more. Although, I'll be honest, I do like this one here. I'll link the video below to that video when I put it together and modded it and did some additional things with it. So I also have an SNES Junior that I actually have hooked up right now to my CRT. So I'm not going to show it out because, again, I don't want to have to disconnect it and everything. But that's pretty much what I'm using right now for Super Nintendo. This is more of a display piece, although I might do an additional mod with this. We'll see in the future. Not sure. I've got original Super Nintendo controllers. The Junior that I picked up came with 4 controllers. So I went ahead and fixed up 2 of them, cleaned them up and everything. So I've got some spare parts with the other 2 controllers just in case. So now let's move on to the bread and butter. This is a Super Game Boy. If you're not sure what this does, it's basically an adapter that lets you play your Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo. And the way it does this is there's an actual Game Boy inside here. And all the Super Nintendo does is basically take the video feed, the audio feed, and display it on your television through the Super Nintendo, and then also takes your Super Nintendo controllers and redirects the input into the Game Boy PCB inside here. But that's not all. This also would allow you to play your games in kind of like a limited color. So this would allow you to add a color or apply a color to each particular shade. There were also some preloaded palettes in here, and there were special games that had Super Game Boy compatibility, which had custom palettes. All the games displayed in the border because the resolution and aspect ratio of the Game Boy games wasn't quite the same as what the Super Nintendo could do. So they added a border around, which is actually kind of nice for some of the games. So in the corner there is a Game Genie. It is a video game enhancer. It is not a cheat device. But basically, yeah, it lets you cheat. You can sit there and plug a game into it, and you do things like you give yourself infinite lives,
moon jumping, which is just basic being able to jump a lot higher than you normally could. Unlimited power-ups, unlimited money. Depending on what the game did, you could improve it, although you can also make your own codes and break the game possibly. And so, yeah. Fun little device, though. I picked it up. I forget where, some local game store, I think. Did not come with the code book, but that's okay because you can find all the codes and then some online now. So, and just as we did with the NES, we'll just start from left to right. Another one of those X-in-1 multi-carts that I picked up. This was, again, just out of curiosity and also for testing purposes, which came in real handy when I was trying to diagnose the three, full repair Super Nintendos that came in. So the shell quality is going to be roughly equivalent to an original one. It's decent. It works, Again, I don't recommend necessarily buying these because they're legally gray at the very least. So next is Donkey Kong Country, if I could focus here. And this was a great action platforming game. It utilized pre-rendered graphics, which was something kind of new, at least for the 16-bit era. But it's a great little platformer. Graphics are fantastic. The music track is, the soundtrack is very good too. But it's your typical action platformer. Run around, stomping enemies, collecting, instead of coins or rings, you collect bananas. And you get to the end, big baddie, etc. Next is a repro cart. It's very light, but it is a repro of the Japanese-only Dragon Quest 1 and 2, which is a 16-bit port of Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior 1 and 2. Enhanced graphics, enhanced soundtrack, etc. There was a demake that was created for the Game Boy Color, which was released in the West. Similar graphic style and the enhanced soundtrack, but obviously without having real instruments or anything like that. But I picked it up as a repro because, again, it does not exist in the West here as a actual release. Although I'm trying to find a Super Famicom version of the game just so that I have a legit copy. So next we've got Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Not a very well-received game, especially using the Final Fantasy moniker. But Squaresoft decided that, those Americans, they don't know how to actually play JRPGs. That's why they're not selling. Well, we're going to make an easy one that anyone can pick up and play. And it is easy. It is a very simple JRPG. It's your typical trope. You've got your main hero. You've got to collect 4 crystals or save 4 crystals or rejuvenate 4 crystals, whatever tropes that are typical of Final Fantasy games of the era. And you run around fighting enemies, leveling up, magic power, finding buddies to help you go around and fight and everything. It's actually not a bad game if you measure your expectations. Great soundtrack, I will say that. But the one of the controversies of it is that you don't have random encounters. There you can see where all the enemies are on the map. They're all static. They're not just roaming around. But it's not a bad role-playing game, again, if you measure your expectations. The soundtrack alone is probably a good enough reason to pick up the game. Again, it's not going to take you super long to beat this one. Probably a few hours and that's it. So the next game is Illusion of Gaia. It's part of an unofficial trilogy. I don't have the other 2 games, and actually I don't have the third one for sure because it was a European release only. It might have been released in Japan, I don't remember. But I know for sure it was released in PAL regions. That was Terra Enigma. This is Illusion of Gaia. Can't remember the name of the first game in the series for some reason. It's escaping me right now. Soul Blazer, that's what it was. And even those 3 games were kind of unofficial sequels to the ActRaiser series. So, but this one, again, it's your Zelda-style action-adventure game, RPG elements, leveling up, things like that. Great storyline, great music. The plot, like I said, is really good. If you don't have this game, pick it up. Next is this black cartridge, and no, this is not a repro or a clone or anything. This is actually how Killer Instinct arrived on the Super Nintendo. This here is a 16-bit port of the arcade game Killer Instinct, which was supposed to come out with the N64. Anyway, this was actually a pretty good 16-bit fighter. It has a great soundtrack, and when you bought it originally, it came with a CD inside, which had a real recording of the soundtrack. So like real instruments, things like that, not just, wavetable, wave synth, stuff like that. So, but it's a good game, especially if you like fighting games in the 16-bit era. So next, another game that needs no introduction, and that is The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. This is the third Zelda game to come out. This is a sort of prequel to the original Zelda, and same game mechanics. They went back to the roots of Zelda 1, bypassing Zelda 2's changes and things like that. So you're back to the top view overworld type game where you just walk around slashing enemies, getting new power-ups, new weapons, magic, etc. Saving Princess Zelda as usual. So I'm not going to talk too much about it because pretty much everyone should already know what this game is about. But it was a great game, great soundtrack. Still holds up today, and it's probably one of my favorite Zelda games. Next is Out of This World. It's also known as Another World, especially for those of you that played it on the Amiga. There was I don't know if there was a Genesis version of the game, but there was a Sega CD version of the game as well as a sequel to it. You're a physicist, you show up to work one day, working on a particle accelerator or something like that. Lightning strikes, you get warped into a new world. And the entire time you're on the run because you're being hunted by enemies, monsters, insects, aliens, etc. You befriend another alien, you guys try to escape, etc., etc. This game kind of weirded me out as a kid when I saw it. It was just, I don't know what it was about it, but it just freaked me out for some reason. So I didn't have it as a kid. I picked it up now to add to my game collection because why not? It's supposed to be a good one. One of these days I will actually sit down and play through it. Next game is Super Mario All-Stars and Super Mario World. This here was basically a 16-bit port of the original Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Bros. 2, Super Mario Bros. 3, what they called the Lost Levels here in the West, which was the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2. And then this particular one also added Super Mario World. 16-bit upgrades to the original NES counterparts, including graphics, sound, etc. Great game. Pick it up. Not much to say about it. It's Mario. And then I also have Street Fighter II Turbo. The Super Nintendo was probably the first time you could play the original Street Fighter II at home. And Nintendo got the rights to the game, of course, based on all kinds of reasons that I'm not going to go into in here. But the Genesis ultimately ended up getting Street Fighter II Special Championship Edition, which was closer to the arcade version than the Super Nintendo version, although the Super Nintendo version had better graphics and sound, asterisk. But as a result of the Championship Edition, there's also Street Fighter II Turbo, which addressed some of the concerns of the original Street Fighter II being too slow and things like that. Plus, it allowed you to actually play as the bosses. Great fighting game. The only one I would recommend over this would be Super Street Fighter II. All right, we're going to move on to the next column here. So we'll first address these here. I have the original Final Fantasy V for the Super Famicom, but because I can't read Japanese, I picked up a repro card of it here, and this one has the translation patch applied to it. It's actually a very well-built repro. I have a video out, and I'll try to remember the link below, but it's Final Fantasy. We never got this release officially in the West for whatever reason. But if you get a chance to play Final Fantasy V, whether you buy a repro or you have like an EverDrive or something like that with the translation patch on it, it's actually a really good game, good music, good storyline. Pick it up. Next is Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars. It's basically a JRPG featuring Mario characters. It's one of the first times where Mario and Bowser will team up and work together, not counting like Mario Kart or anything like that. But it's a fun little game, great story, great music. It was co-developed by Squaresoft, so you know it's going to be a good game. If you haven't had a chance to play this yet, it is a pricey game. It typically goes for around $90 US, give or take. I saved a few bucks because mine had a little bit of a damaged label, but I don't care because it's not about me buying it to flip or anything like that. It's about playing. So had it as a kid, wanted to get it again as an adult. Next is Tetris and Dr. Mario. I mentioned this earlier. Now this is the player's choice version. It's Tetris and Dr. Mario upgraded with 16-bit graphics and sound. If you want a version of Tetris and or Dr. Mario to play, I recommend this one. And just as I did with the NES, we'll cover these three together because they're all basically the same game. These are the WWF games. You've got Super WrestleMania, the 16-bit
sequel to the original WrestleMania on the NES. You've got Royal Rumble, and then the final, quote-unquote, asterisk 16-bit WWF game in the same line of the others. Now, I added the asterisk because there was actually one more. There was WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. That game was basically kind of like a WWF wrestling version of NBA Jam, where it was more comical, more arcadey than quote-unquote strategic and, stuff like that. More arcadey than a simulator, which is what these were. I guess you could technically consider. Not quite, because they weren't, all that realistic, but it worked. So that's pretty much it for my Nintendo and Super Nintendo collection. Like I said before, this is going to be a part of multi-parter. I didn't want to include everything in one video because I didn't want the video to be super long. Figured I'd just start with the basics, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and then work my way down through the GameCube, Wii U, possibly the Switch, and go from there. And then there'll be other videos in the future going over my Master System and Genesis collection, my PlayStation collection, Xbox, etc. So what do you guys think? My collection is going to be continuing to grow, although it's slowed down significantly because a lot of the games that I want to get are either hard to find or pricey or both. And I kind of need to measure my expectations in finding them anytime soon for a reasonable price. So I will be adding to it over time. And as I add, I might do updated tours. We'll see. But what did you guys think of this? What do you think of my collection so far? Any games I should add to it? Any games you see here that you didn't think of? Any corrections that you need to make? Go ahead and leave some comments below. Otherwise, I thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you later.